afternoon guys, Miss Billingham here, going to carry on reading for you The Twits by Roald Dahl. So we got to the point where we'd met Mr. and Mrs. Twit, and Mrs. Twit had taken her glass eye out and put it in the bottom of Mr. Twit's glass, and he said, I'll get you back for that. Right, let's see. So the next chapter is called The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided to put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got onto his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itching tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawl over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" she screamed, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's that giant sliggly worm I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. It's got teeth like screwdrivers." Can you see her screaming in her bed? "Help!" Mrs. Twit screamed. "Save me, it's all over my feet." "I'll bite off your toes," said Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed, fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. I don't think I'd like a frog on my face. "By golly, it is a giant skiddly-whapper," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed, flew down the stairs, and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Strange. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and then put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," said Mrs. Twit, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms in. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, taking a mouthful. "It's too, squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitty," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next week, okay?" Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten all of his plate, and then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had that nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" "Because it was worms." Mrs. Twit laughed, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. They don't sound like very nice people, do they? To pay Mrs. Twit back from the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick down to the workshed. There he snuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of her stick. This made the stick even longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't even notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit snuck out to put another bit of tiny wood on the end. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra thickness of wood to the bottom of her walking stick. He did it very neatly, so the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it's happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller each day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening slowly. You can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even though it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. You see that her walking stick's all the way up there. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How could a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth is happening?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick. It's you," Mr. Twit said, grinning horribly. "It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're a shrinking woman," said Mr. Twit. It's not possible." "Oh yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never," she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat. See how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. That's not very nice. So they just keep playing tricks on each other. What I want you to do in the time that I have a bit of a rest and you wait for the next couple of chapters, I want you to think about the nastiest trick you've ever played on someone. Don't go playing any new tricks though. Okay. Be kind, stay safe, look after yourselves.